Hey everybody, this is Jaxn. Today I want to revisit something that I already talked about for 3 hours on a stream, and that is a D&D books tier list. Now, all these tier lists are subjective. It is going to include my biases, because why wouldn't it? The question that I am going to ask myself so it can help you determine why I'm putting things in what tier is, should you buy this book? That's very important. Uh, we have finite amount of dollars that we can spend on our D&D hobby, so it's a big question of how we want to spend that. There's a lot of books out there. You probably can't buy all of them, or even if you could, you probably shouldn't, because some books are better than others. One other disclaimer I want to give very quickly is that I, as a DM, don't run a whole lot of published adventures. It's happened occasionally, and I will still, when I was working in the game store, pick up a new adventure book, flip through it, see what's in here for people who don't want to run the adventure, because some of them will have just very good monsters in the back, or very good player resources for backgrounds or subclasses. So, while I don't know as much about those, I will still be commenting on them. Just maybe don't take my word as law on those so much. But let's see what we can do. Let's apply some true sight to these books. First thing we have up is the first thing created for 5th edition, and that is the 5th edition starter set. I'm going to put this in B. I actually like the starter set a lot, mostly because it is $20 and probably the best $20 you can spend if you've never played a role-playing game before and you want to get introduced to 5th edition. You may notice there, that means if you have played D&D or an RPG before, this one is not so great. It's not going to do that much for you. It is what helped me learn D&D 5th edition when it first came out. The Lost Mines of Phandelver is maybe the perfect first-time D&D adventure. So if you're new, it's still worthwhile. If you're not new, maybe not so much, but I'm going to keep it in B. Next, we have the player handbook, and here's a hot take. I am actually going to put it also in B tier, right next to the starter set. But why? It's the player handbook. It's the one rule book you need to run the game. Why would you not put this in S tier? Well, because in 2024, we're going to have a new D&D that is going to upend this book. And even within the last year or two, there's so much free resources online, or so many friends you have that already have a player handbook that can say, oh, here, check this out for free. I actually kind of don't think it's worth everyone at your table spending that $50 to have this book on hand. If you are someone who wants to have this book that you can go into and write your own notes and put your own sticky notes in and really feel like you own the game that you're playing, then yeah, buy this. It's not bad, except for the fact of how hard it is to actually read the rulebook parts that are in this. A whole lot of the subclasses have been out power crawled through the years, so I don't know. I wish I could keep the player handbook in S tier, but I don't think that's a reality. If you have $50 that you can spend on D&D, ask your friends if you can peek at their player handbook, and maybe you get something like, I don't know, Xanathar's we'll get to later. The monster manual is in a very similar boat as the player's handbook. Yes, it's one of the essentials that you need to run the game, especially if you're a DM, but it is being overshadowed by these books that are going back and editing on the base material that came out in the game's first few years. I'm going to keep it in B, maybe ahead of the starter set. It does still have a lot in there, and even if you're a player, understanding how monster rules work, or for druids, understanding what things you can turn into, is important. The Dungeon Master's Guide, I am actually going to drop down into C tier. One of the biggest myths that I had to dispel for a lot of people coming into the game store was, okay, I want to be a DM, I'm buying the Dungeon Master's Guide, let's go! The Dungeon Master's Guide offers a whole lot of theory on crafting stories and crafting worlds, which is okay, and then half the book is dedicated to magic items, which, I don't know about you guys, but most tables that I have been at make their own magic items by the DM or by the players, so you almost don't need that. A lot of the theories and the variant rules in there are just things that I don't see tables using at all, even when the DM does have this up on their wall. It's a resource that I still go back to occasionally, but again, I think with a lot of the newer rule books that we have, throwing down $50 on a hard copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide just doesn't feel as good as it should. Now we have the Sword Coast Adventures Guide, and I'll highlight my own biases here. I don't like the Forgotten Realms. I think the standard world of D&D is just that, bog standard. No offense to some of the books by R.A. Salvatore and such are still good novels, but is it a good setting to play in always for every table? No, I don't think so, and most settings, I could say, don't do that. This book does not have great player options in it. It was our first look at new subclasses in the game, and anytime I see anybody play a subclass from this, the player always winds up being disappointed. It's not a good book. It's very small, like it should have been a $20 or a $30 book instead of a full $50. Yeah, F tier is like, I can't justify this purchase at all, not even on sale. Don't get Sword Coast Adventures Guide. We're getting into some of these published adventures, and we're starting with one that I have actually played through, and that is Princes of the Apocalypse. It is one of these early adventures that is kind of saying, hey, here's your D&D tutorial, kids, and unfortunately it doesn't have very much to offer beyond that. When I played in it, I had a great time, but it was because this provided the bare bones of an adventure that our fantastic DM, Adam, was then able to go on top of and add his own plots, his own setting. It's not bad if you find this in a game store's sale bin for $10-15, like I've seen it used usually. It's not a bad adventure, but compared to all the published adventures that we have here, it's just not great. And that is basically the same things that I have to say for Out of the Abyss, for Horde of the Dragon Queen, and Rise of Tiamat, except for those two. I'm actually going to go ahead and drop those into F tier. Yeah, it's Tiamat. It's a big bad villain, but they actually had to re-release these two books by Kobold Press as their own conjoined book years later. And that one might be worth it, but just these two on their own, I think, are in F tier. Never buy. And sorry to continue with the negativity right now, but Acquisitions Incorporated is the most bizarre official Wizards of the Coast D&D product I've ever seen. It all takes on this jokey element, which is already present in any D&D podcast you've ever seen, but why the guys at Penny Arcade got the focus here is beyond me. I have nothing wrong with Penny Arcade. It's a perfectly fine little webcomic, and I know they played their game. But I don't know why this was a D&D product. The player options in here are all gags that I couldn't actually see anyone playing for real, and then there's problematic stuff like Chaos Bolts that is just kind of broken. It's not good. I kind of see what they were going for here, and I think the Rick and Morty package did it better while also being $20 instead of $50. Rough time for the S and A tier. I promise I have good thoughts coming. Storm King's Thunder. I have never heard anyone talk about using this adventure. I know when I was thinking about running a published adventure, this was something I considered. I liked the idea of giant politics going on. I'll put it in D tier next to Out of the Abyss and Princes of the Apocalypse. And in fact, Abyss I will put ahead of Apocalypse just because I have heard people who ran this as their first adventure and enjoyed it, whereas Princes of the Apocalypse people don't have great things to say about. All right, here we go. Curse of Strahd hops right up into the A tier. This is a classic D&D adventure that has been perfectly revamped into the 5th edition modern landscape. I say perfectly because there was some stuff going on with the Vistani not being a great representation. They more or less fixed that when they re-released this book. I think that a lot of DMs, if your players have those sensitivities, like I know me and a lot of people I play with do, you can go ahead and buy this book and take that stuff out anyway without having to buy the newer box set. It's a great adventure. Strahd is a wonderful villain. Enough said. We get into Volo's Guide, and this is an interesting one, I think. It has some very cool player options in it with races like the ASMR. The monsters in it, however, I don't know, are always just kind of icky to me. They never really pop. They don't go that far beyond what we were given in the monster manual. And a good chunk of the book right at the start is dedicated to just talking about, hey, here's more about hags and beholders and goblins. And it all feels like, even though it's more of that kind of bog standard flavor. I want to like this one more. Volo's helped me really expand on what I liked about D&D, but only because so many things in here were not quite to the level I wanted it to be. I'm still gonna give it bottom of C tier, maybe. I don't think it deserves to be down with like these adventures, but it's a rough buy considering what's out there today. Next up, we have Tales from the Yawning Portal. This is really interesting to me, and I'm glad that WotC kept putting out books like this, because rather than being a whole adventure path, it's sort of an anthology of dungeons. And especially if you're somebody who likes the Dungeon Crawl Classics feel, I think Tales from the Yawning Portal is a good way to run your Beer and Pretzels D&D game and have a good, dark, metal time of it. It also has the Tomb of Horrors in there, which, you know, I have some issues with, but if you want to say, hey guys, we're going to run a meat grinder, that's the meat grinder to run. Tales from the Yawning Portal is a very good buy, especially among adventure books. I'm going to set it in B tier. The Tomb of Annihilation. People don't like this one. I think it has some interesting stuff in there with surviving the elements. I, am a sucker for Yuan Ti, and I think Acererak is cool. Let's put it in D tier with the rest of these adventures, but I'll put it ahead of Out of the Abyss. Xanathar's Guide to Everything, I am excited to say, is my first S tier. It really does have a little bit of everything in it, and unlike the old Dungeon Master's Guide or Volo's Guide to Monsters that I'll occasionally pick up and look at for my games now, Xanathar's is something that I always have at the table. If nothing else, than just for the fact that at the end of the book, it has a list of a few thousand NPC names you can grab. It has great stuff for characters. The subclasses that are in this book did a really good job, while I think not being too overpowered beyond the player handbook, except for the Ranger, which, let's face it, needed it from the player's handbook. It's just so colorful. Xanathar's little asides on the page are more interesting to read than Volo. It's a really good book. It's S tier. This could easily be your first introduction book for new players into D&D. Going on more adventures, we have Ghosts of Saltmarsh. I wish that this one was better than what it is. I love One Piece. My first DM experience was making a nautical adventure, so I thought this was going to provide the robust nautical rules that you needed to run it, even if you're not playing in Saltmarsh, and boy oh boy, are those rules boring. Sorry. And the classic adventure is revamped for the modern day. Okay, they did a good workmanship job of translating the material and making it new, but I don't know that many people who get excited about fighting Sahuagin. It's just not that fun, even if I want it to be. It does get some points for being well made, but it's in D tier. Sorry. The Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica. This is one that I own, and I don't know anyone else among my D&D friends that bought this book, which is a shame. I think it introduces a very good setting with very good politics. I think that the information that it provides on making characters who are all from different guilds but have to work together as a party, uh, showed some kind of inspired rules writing on behalf of WotC's team, and we later saw stuff from this book get revamped and put into stuff like Tasha's. Uh, I think it's a very good book, especially if you are into Magic the Gathering and D&D. Ravnica is a great setting to play in, and it perfectly shows you how you can turn those awesome Magic the Gathering cards that you might not get to play because they're not meta, turning those into D&D monsters. I think it's a good book, but I am going to admit that it's not for everyone, and even though I like it, I also don't dig around in it that much because the flavor is so specific to Ravnica that it can be hard to pull from other places. I'm going to put it in B tier, behind the Yawning Portal, which is just more applicable to more people. Next, we have Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, and I think this is an S tier book. I was actually kind of disappointed to hear that it was going out of print, so that they could make the new Mordenkainen's book. Remember how I said I don't really like Forgotten Realms and I'm not a great fan of Greyhawk either? Well, the planescape that comes kind of from Greyhawk that is presented in this book is amazing. Everything with the Githzerai and Githyanki, the Blood War, come on. It's just very good. Mordenkainen is cool, and Gary Gygax's character, that's bonus points. The monsters in this book contrast from the monsters presented in Volo's Guide by being very cool and interesting, very well thought out. I think this is a really good book, and since it's out of print, it'll be interesting to see if this is on sale bins or if this winds up being like a collector's product. But I think it's definitely one you should buy as a DM. Moving on to the Essentials Kit. This is kind of like the Starter Kit 2.0. They tried to branch out and do some stuff here with duet play between a DM and one player, sidekicks. This teaches you more about creating your own character, whereas the Starters Kit said, hey, we don't have any time, go save Fandelver, here's a fighter, go. It's okay. It's not a bad buy for 20 bucks, but is there anything in there that's very inspiring, exciting? Not really. The adventure in it is good and serviceable, so let's put it in C tier, but towards the bottom. The Eberron, what is it? Eberron, Rising from the Last War. That shows how much I pull this one from my shelf, even though I have the limited edition cover. That is very pretty. A lot of what I said about Ravnica kind of applies to Eberron. It's a very niche flavor done very well. But if your table doesn't want to play in a world with dino riding halflings and robots, it's not going to be for you. The book doesn't have much else to offer because it is very solidified in delivering Eberron, a world that I think is pretty cool and that I've actually used for a lot of one-shots, but never as a campaign. If what I just said about robots and dinosaur riding halflings is cool to you, though, Eberron is wonderful. So, while I think that Ravnica is actually a better put-together book, I don't know. No, they belong right next to each other. I'm keeping them on B tier. Waterdeep Dragon Heist. I had a look at this one. We had someone in the game store that really wanted us to basically run this book for our summer camps, and I looked through it. I read about the adventure. I read a lot about it online and decided this is not really what we need to be doing. It's very well put together. Matt Mercer's influence shines through. I like how it's not just one adventure path. You have a few different villains in the city who you can pick as your nemesis. And being a model for, city-centric play rather than open world or dungeon-centric play is really nice. It's a well-put-together book. If you're looking for an adventure, I think this could actually make a good first adventure for your table. I still want to put it in C tier, but I'm going to put it right behind the Dungeon Master's Guide. The follow-up book to that, Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage. This is another one that I've just never heard anybody say anything good about. It has a nice dungeon in it. The monster manual at the back has been adapted and remade because it had some good monsters. It's good mega dungeon design for sure. But I don't know anyone that is excited about this book, and I'm certainly not either. Not to say there's not good stuff in it. I'll put it ahead of the more modern adventures, or the older adventures, excuse me. But yeah, it's a solid D. Descent into Avernus, Baldur's Gate. I actually forgot to say Baldur's Gate there because of how laughable that city's inclusion is in this book. Almost everyone I know says skip the first chapter or maybe the first two chapters of this book and just go straight to hell. Because once you get to hell, Descent into Avernus is awesome. Zerial is an incredible villain, I think right up there with Strahd. The different forking paths that you can go on, as well as the open world of driving your Mad Max Hell tank around, is very well done. But there are parts of this book that really show the bad D&D mentality, sorry, that is still within WotC. And if you need the example here, just one thing that really turned me off from running chapter 1 is you get your party together, they're going into the gates at Baldur's Gate, but there's a refugee crisis, the guards aren't letting people in, and a little sidebar says, what do you do if your players just want to turn around? Kill them! Lol. And it's like, no, that's actually not funny. That's actually a terrible way to play D&D, and you printed that in one of your books. What is wrong with you? The good stuff is good, but the bad stuff is bad. And when only half of the book is really applicable to your table, that's what prevents me from putting this right next to Curse of Strahd. So I'm going to put it down here. You know what? I'll actually jump this one kind of ahead of the starter kit. We have Mythic Odysseys of Theros, and this is prime bias for me. This is an S tier book. It's so good. It's so well made. I had this big problem with 5th edition D&D when I first got into it. The player's handbook and the monster manual and the dungeon master's guide all refer to gods as this big thing that are just assumed to be in the world, and they're super important to the game. All the monsters pay attention to them and all players, but there's not really that much material on the gods, except for in Sword Coast Adventures Guide, but what's there is bad. So this book rose up to that challenge of saying, here's what we actually need about gods, and holy cow, it does a great job. The piety system that adds onto your character sheet based on how well you are playing up your powers to your chosen god is wonderful and has enhanced every game that I've used it in. The player races in here, satyrs and centaurs and minotaurs, have always been popular picks with my players whenever I tell them they're available. Kids have also loved playing in this world more than a lot of the other settings here, more than Eberron, oddly enough. So, is it niche? Probably. At first you might look at this and say, well, I'm not a Magic the Gathering player, so I don't care about this Magic setting. You can actually remove all of the Magic lore names and just run this as Fantasy Greece, straight up Hercules, Clash of the Titans adventures, and have a wonderful time at your table. It's a really good book, you guys. It's S tier, absolutely. We go on to Explorer's Guide to Wildmount. I don't know. I don't know why this book was released, I'll be honest, because I like Critical Role, I respect Critical Role, a lot of people love and respect Critical Role, but I think it's telling that the Critical Role crew put out a separate setting book, not through Wizards of the Coast, when they were looking to capitalize on their world. Still, the stuff that is in this book is interesting. These are certainly the most colorful and magical little biomes and monsters at the back of the book. Holy cow. But one thing that holds this back for me is that the subclasses in this book, I think, make the game worse. Chronologist and Graviturgist and Echo Knight. Woof. I don't like them. And players either don't like playing them or really like playing them because they see how, I don't use this word a lot, but overpowered they are. Still, it's very interesting. I can recognize that this doesn't quite hit my funny bone for what I like in a D&D setting, but other people have enjoyed it. I'm going to be nice and I'm going to keep it in C tier. I'll put it ahead even of the Essentials kit. We get into Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. This book was controversial when it came out, weirdly enough, because everybody kind of agrees that Xanathar's Guide to Everything is great, so when we get another Everything book, it should have been great too, right? But it's a lot slimmer, it deals with a lot of different branching variants in the game, and everyone that I've talked to has something in this book that they never look at and they wish wasn't there. Myself included, I like everything in this book except for group patrons, which takes up several pages, and I don't understand why. I don't think it's a very useful feature. But then I talked to another friend who's a DM, and they absolutely love using group patrons, and so do their players. It's a very mixed bag, but I think that is good for the game. I think it's good to recognize that D&D can be a lot of things, and I think the people that are really negative about Tasha's Cauldron of Everything want the game to be their specific thing. So I'm going to recognize that this book isn't for everyone. I think you should look through it and, you know, if 75% of the ideas here are something that you want at your table, it's a very good buy. If it's something like 50%, maybe don't spend the full $50 on it. Buy it used from one of the people who are negative and ragging on it. I am going to put it in A tier, and I'm actually going to put it ahead of Curse of Strahd, because this is an everything, everybody product. Curse of Strahd might not work out for people who just don't care about vampires and gothic shit. We get Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden. I'll be honest, it belongs down here with some of the early adventures. It gets the job done. There's fun stuff in there. There's some okay monsters. In fact, I've heard more good things from customers about this one than I have from Mad Mage, and it's just better put together than Saltmarsh. So I'll put it at the top of D tier, but this is still an adventure book and not a great one. It's not the worst, but I can't be excited about it. Strixhaven, on the other hand, is an idea that I can get excited about, and I think a lot of people can. If you grew up with Harry Potter but now find that material problematic, but you would like to play at a magical school, I think Strixhaven, yet another magic setting, does a fantastic job of that. It even incorporates the setup of going to school for about a year, taking a quick break for your character to level up and get new relationships, and then coming back into the game. There's a lot of fun stuff in here. The dragons at the end of this book, based on the series of Magic the Gathering cards that came out with this, are actually wonderful. I think some of the best big bad monsters in the game. There are dating sim asides about the NPCs, which is an absolute favor win for wanting to make a high school themed campaign. It's very fun. I think this appeals to more people than it doesn't appeal to. Some of the character options that are provided for players are very good as well. So, I don't know. I think it belongs up here in the B tier. It's not as realized a world as Eberron now that I'm hovering here. So I will put it at the end of B tier as a goodbye if the flavor is for you. Candlekeep Mysteries. This is only the second anthology anthology adventure book that came out for D&D, and I think that's a shame. I think we should have more of these. Candlekeep carries on the tradition of being really good. These adventures are smaller than the ones presented in Yawning Portal, whereas those might take a few sessions to get to. I could reasonably see a lot of Candlekeep Mysteries being one-shots, so anytime your party takes a left turn or finds a mysterious tome that sucks them into an alternate universe, this will provide you a nice little one-shot, even in a homebrew game. Candledeep Mysteries is very good. I'll actually say that it belongs right here next to Yawning Portal, but I'm gonna say it's better than Yawning Portal. If you had to pick between the two, go for Candledeep. Fitzban's Treasury of Dragons. I think we needed, and the game needed, a book that was just about dragons. It's in the title, right? But the monster manual provides a slew of dragons that, aside from having different breaths and different personalities that you can choose to play or not to play, didn't give us all that much. Fitzban's really gets into dragons, how to make them cool, how to make them unique, and I think it does a good job. It doesn't do quite everything that I thought it would do, though. I find myself referring back to this one less and less. I find a lot of players and DMs not really talking about this one. I think it did a really good job for what it is, but I can't deny that it doesn't quite hit the mark of being great into the A tier. Still, I am going to put this in B tier, and I will actually put it ahead of the Monster Manual, and you know what? Ahead of the Player's Handbook, because 1D&D is now here. It means that you can still have Fitzban's Treasury of Dragons in 2024, 2025, and be using those rules to make very nice dragons in whatever the new version of D&D we have is. We get to Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft? Something of Ravenloft. It's S tier. It's very good. I'm actually going to put it ahead of Mordenkainen's and Theros, because this is one of the books that not only provides a setting, but teaches you how to be a better DM. Safety tools were briefly brought up in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which is also a reason why some people don't like it, because they don't respect ideas like consent. But it recognizes that safety and consent are very important when you are running a horror adventure meant to scare the player characters, but not necessarily the players. And it establishes these rules very well. There is a nice little section of the book that just goes through and says, what is body horror? What is gothic horror? It refers back to books like the Monster Manual to be able to pull other monsters from, rather than reprinting material and putting it in here, which coincidentally is also another reason why some people don't like Tasha's, which I'll give them points on that, is kind of legitimate. The little adventure that is presented in here is quite nice. The monsters are amazing, and there's just 1,000 little campaign pitches within these pages. Something I also didn't mention in the Mythic Odysseys of Theros book is that each god or each religion goes through and gives you a random roll table where you can pick and choose, or random roll, ideas for your next campaign or one-shot. Van Richten's has that all over the place. It provides about a dozen detailed settings, and then like 50 not detailed settings, just rapid fire. There's a train and it's cursed. It's going to run around in circles for infinity. Go have an adventure there. And they're all good. I think a lot of people slept on this one because they already owned Curse of Strahd and thought it was going to be the same thing. It's not. It is one of the absolute best D&D books. I'm glad that I have it on my shelf, and I actually bring it around to the table at all of my games now, just like Xanathar's. Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse. I have actually looked through this one since I did this tier list on stream, and I like it. I think that the additions that it makes to monsters is very good. Naturally, I kind of want to put it ahead of Volo's and, well, maybe not Mordenkainen's, because it has put all of that information together and revamped it for the new era. A lot of the balances that were made to the monsters to make them better reflect their CR and make them easier to run for the DM and make them more fun for the player were already things that, frankly, I was doing in my games. And I'm not saying, puh, WotC just put stuff in there that I was already doing. They don't know their stuff. No, it shows that they know their stuff. I'm glad that it's there, and I'm glad that more people get to read that perspective. So I will actually put Monsters of the Multiverse up here in A tier. I also didn't like this book when it first came out because it came in a box set with, I believe, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything and Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and buying that $90 box set was not very justifiable if you already had Tasha's and Xanathar's. But buying the book on its own as a $50 purchase is going to be a fantastic boon for your table, not only for the DM for providing a bunch of revamped monsters that play better, but it consolidates a lot of the races for players into this book with new revamped, rebalanced rules. I like Monsters of the Multiverse a lot, and in fact, I'll put it ahead of 5th edition's best adventure, Curse of Strahd. The Wild Beyond the Witchlight. We have another adventure book that I haven't ran and probably never will, but I spent a long time looking at this one because I had heard how you can run it without combat. It does it very well. It really leans into the aspect of fairies being persnickety and wanting deals, and being able to have those diplomatic encounters that, while you're not swinging a sword, can be just as deadly and have severe consequences for your characters. The art in this book might just be the best out of anything on screen right now. And the monsters in the back provide a lot of fun, as well as providing some interesting little odes to classic D&D. I think it's a very good book, and this is another one that I think could be your table's first D&D adventure. There are some niche things about it. Its version of the Feywild is kind of reminiscent of Alice in Wonderland and Wizard of Oz. It's very whimsical, very silly, which I think it should be both of those. But if that is not exactly what you want as your Fey, if you see Fey, like me, as kind of more elegant and aloof Tolkien elves that are still very fickle and emotional, this might not be for you. So I'm actually very tempted to put Wild Beyond the Witchlight in A tier. No, I'm sorry, it shouldn't sit next to Strahd. Let's put it down here, right with Fitzbands. The new starter set is actually one that I don't know very much about. I imagine that they've done a good job with it and revamped it. I imagine it's still a good buy at $20, but it probably has a lot of newer language that needed to be fixed from when this game came out in 2014. I'll go ahead and put it ahead of the old starter kit. They will probably both do good things for your table, but newer ones new and shiny. The Radiant Citadel is the third anthology book. I've had a look at this one, and they continue to improve themselves here. I am actually going to pop it into A tier behind Strahd because I think grabbing any one of these adventures will be a good time for your table. We got two more. Call of the Netherdeep. I was not excited to hear that this one came out. A lot of people didn't even know this was related to Critical Role at all. I didn't even see a lot of fanfare from Critical Role really about this one. I don't know anyone who's had a good time with it. I don't know anyone who's played it. The cover art and the monsters in it are frankly boring. This seems like an older D&D product and not something that came out within the last year, and I think it deserves to get put down in F tier maybe at the start of it. Finally, we have the Spelljammer bundle, and unlike the last bundle that came out with Monsters of the Multiverse, I think that this is a good way, while still marketing that puts more money in Hasbro's pockets, I think this is a good way to package up a new world. Eberron mostly had the split between here of here's stuff for players, here's stuff for the DM, and here's an adventure if you want to run specifically in this setting, but it put it into 3 separate books. I think it's a good idea. Is it worth the buy at the slightly bigger price? I still think so. I think Spelljammer, like a lot of things here, is very niche, but I think that niche does appeal to a lot more people than something like Eberron or Ravnica does. I'm very excited about this product. I know a lot of people who are. The adventure seems like a lot of fun. The ship rules seem like a lot of fun. The player races are a hoot, and it's D&D in space. I find it hard to not like this one, and I'm actually going to drop it into A tier. So, that's all. Let's see. I only talked for 40 minutes. That's a lot shorter than 3 hours, right? Please let me know in the comments if you had some of these where I had said, oh, this is an adventure I've never run, but I've looked through it. If you've actually run it and you want to comment that a book is good, please let me know. Would you fudge any of my books up or down? Maybe I can make a re-release of this video taking in some of my friends and commenters' scores on this to try to get a more community aggregate. But like I said, this is a lot of my opinions. S tier, you can absolutely go out and buy right now. A tier, still feel good about, just might not be for everyone. B, it's a good buy. Sure, why not? C, maybe consider if you actually need it. D, you probably don't need it, but maybe if it's in a sales bin, go for it. And F, there's no reason you should get these, and just having it on your D&D wall might actually hurt your game. Very good. I hope this was fun and informative for y'all, and I hope you give yourself advantage and have a nat 20 day. Bye-bye.